There is a transition. Gas is part of the transition. It's a lower carbon footprint than other ways of generating.
Let me introduce you to the world of the green zealot. Gas plants, yes, gas turbine plants to provide us with energy, can carry on under a condition. I call it conditional gas.
Provided they demonstrate that they can decarbonise according to the government strategy, which is full decarbonisation by 2050, there is a role to play because we need energy.
Has a role to play because we need energy, but it must behave. If we're going to accept it, it's got to have this plan to get rid of its CO2 by 2050. He goes on in a minute, as you'll see, to say this is done by the burying of the CO2. So the CO2 they produce, they're going to have a separate works, they're going to compress it into a liquid and bury it under the sea or somewhere. You know, that's the plan. It's silly. It's a silly plan. And I'll expose that very quickly. But if we don't agree, if the gas company doesn't agree, what are you going to do? Not have the gas? If it doesn't agree to this ridiculous net zero by 2050, are you not going to have the gas? You're acting as if we'll only allow you, to provide us with energy, providing you do this. Well, it's silly if you think about that. Really silly. Anyway, let's continue, not just with the one expert, but with also another member of the Green Party from the Isle of Man who contributes to this madness.
Kroger Gas and the Iristane Wind Farm, John Curtis. Briefly, what's your view on those two?
There is a transition. Gas is part of the transition. It's a lower carbon footprint than other ways of generating electricity. It is required. I restate the position I had before on Kroger Gas, that provided the company can demonstrate their net zero strategy, they don't pull a stunt like Manx Gas claiming that they're investing in all sorts of tree forests all over the place, provided they demonstrate that they can decarbonise according to the government strategy, which is full decarbonisation by 2050, there is a role to play because we need energy. There's no question about that. So I work in the energy industry. I'm sure that Bonzo and others will be lined up ready to talk to us about this. I work in the energy industry and I am involved with many companies that produce fossil fuels, but they all have strategies and they're all working towards those strategies. And one of them is, Andy, what are called technology-based carbon removal techniques. These are where, instead of planting trees, for example, you drill holes in the ground, which requires a certain capability, and you actually gather carbon dioxide, compress it and re-inject it back in the ground again. All over the North Sea, there are many projects already in place to do that. The only way actually to reach a balance of net zero is to remove large volumes of carbon dioxide. Nature-based solutions alone are part of that, but they're not the only answer.
Okay, so let's examine this totally bonkers idea of carbon capture. There are two ways you can do carbon capture. One is directly from the air with something like this, where you draw through the air and take the 400 parts per billion CO2 out, and then you condense it and bury it, etc. And the other way is directly as a byproduct of the fossil fuel utility, such as a gas station itself. Right, both of them require huge amounts of energy. So first of all, we'll do the open air very quickly to dispense with that one. So if you're going to suck from the air, you're going to use as much energy doing that as you do in the first place in the fossil fuel plant. And there's no point in doing it. Just look at this. These nutty ideas aren't just confined to the UK, although we do tend to lead the world in them, and the Isle of Man is just the same. So here's one in Iceland. The world's largest stack, that's direct from the air facility, Climeworks, $10 to $15 million orca plant, was opened in Iceland last week and is due to capture 4,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide from the air every year, the equivalent to the emissions of 870 cars. Remember that figure, 870 cars. The captured CO2 is then mixed with water and injected into basalt rock 1 kilometre underground, where it slowly turns into solid carbonate mineral over a 2-year period. That's the idea. How much energy is being used for that? Well, this is a simple explanation. Generally speaking, direct to air, that technology is called DAC technology, works by using giant fans to draw in the air with CO2, roughly at 0.04% of the content of the air, bonding to chemicals known as sorbents. When the sorbent is saturated, it is heated to 80 to 100 degrees C to release the captured dioxide. And of course, that involves an enormous amount of energy. In fact, almost as much energy as was come out of the system that produced the CO2 in the first place. So you've now got to do another plant, have you, to take the energy out, and goes on forever. I mean, it's ridiculous. But as I always try to do, put these figures into some perspective in everyday terms. Let's go back to that claim. 870 cars. That's the amount of emissions we bury in a year for a cost of $10 to $15 million. Never mind the energy used to do it in the first place. But let's just look at that cost and how many cars, say, there are in the UK. Well, cars and light vehicles. And this is without trucks and everything else, just cars and light vehicles. How many? Well, 38.21 million cars and light vehicles. So divide that by the 870 we've just saved the emissions from, and you'd need 58,784 such plants at, say, £10 million each, equals £5.78 trillion, plus no space to live, apparently. And yet, you'd now have to do the same again because of the emissions you've emitted in doing all this. But none of that stops nice video promotions like this about how technology is saving the planet. And of course, back in the UK, the Advisors Energy Systems Catapult, a government-funded body that promotes innovation, states the direct air carbon capture systems would remove up to 48 million tonnes of CO2 from the air each year, and then pump it into disused oil and gas reservoirs under the North or the Irish Sea. Without such a scheme, the UK will never reach its target of net zero emissions by 2050, according to the report by the Energy Systems Catapult government-funded body. So you see, it's just absurd, all this. Just totally absurd. But John Curtis, our energy industry expert here, was advocating capturing the carbon at source, capturing it at the gas plant, and then burying it. Right? So let's look at that second method of lunacy. Well, in this case, you capture the carbon at source as it's emitted, say, from the gas or coal works or whatever it is. So you capture it and you bury it. And the idea in the UK is to bury it, under the North Sea and so on. But you have to do a lot of work to capture this. You need another addition to the gas plant, and that basically consumes about 25% of the power of the gas plant. So you've now reduced let's say the gas plant is outputting 100 megawatts at that rate. You now reduce that to 75 megawatts. So now you've got to actually make that up again. But when you make it up again, you've got to capture that as well. That goes on. But leaving that iteration process to one side, that's the simplicity of it. However, it basically has a problem. It doesn't work. But leaving that to one side for the moment, just look at these figures here. This is the UK's plan by 2030. So in the next 4.5 years is to do this. Well, with a pledge to capture 20 to 30 million tonnes a year by 2030. That's quite a wide range there, 20 to 30, but let's take it as it is. And just how much do we emit annually as a UK? Well, it's 406 million tonnes a year. So if we save 20, see, if we actually bury 20, we buried 4.3%, but if we bury 30, we buried 7.3%. And the budget for this, the modest budget for this, is £20 billion. That's £4 billion a year for the next 5 years. This is obviously more important than giving the winter heat supplement to our old age pensioners, because a person whose only income is the old age pension now has that heat supplement of £300 a winter removed, so we can pay for things like this. A really great priority for the UK government. And on top of that, this is just one of the reasons, along with the £12 billion a year, £60 billion to improve the grid to take on all the wind farms, etc., in the next 5 years. So with the £4 billion a year for the carbon capture, with the £12 billion a year for improving the grid, that's £16 billion a year, you can see where your money's going. And you can see whilst the heat supplement has been removed for pensioners, and I am becoming political on that, whilst that has happened, we're actually spending more and more and more on this net zero nonsense, which makes no difference at all to the world. And by the way, the whole basis is wrong, because CO2 is plant food and is of great benefit to the planet, as is the modest warming we've had since Little Ice Age, because we're far better off now with less extreme weather, warmer weather, higher crop yields, the whole lot, than we ever were back in the Little Ice Age. But it seems in this madness and net zero, they would want to take us back to the Little Ice Age and low CO2 levels, because they believe that CO2 is a control knob for the climate. And that is absurd. So let's get back to why CCS basically doesn't work. It has a long history of failure. CCS has been overpromised and failing to deliver as a tool to fight climate change for decades. Billions of pounds have been spent across the globe trying to prop up CCS technology, and yet there are no working CCS plants in the UK and no consistently working CCS plants in power generation anywhere on Earth. The evidence demonstrates that CCS plants continually underperform or face a myriad of technical issues or are shut down entirely. Now, I wonder who wrote that. Well, believe it or not, it's Friends of the Earth, who also wrote CCS will keep households locked into high energy prices. Absolutely right. But then, of course, Friends of the Earth are wanting more wind farms, which is a spectacular way of keeping high energy prices for everybody. So here is another quote. The entire efficacy of the carbon capture process has been called into question by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its special report on carbon dioxide capture and storage, in which the IPCC stated, CO2 storage is not necessarily permanent. Physical leakage from storage reservoirs is possible via 1. Gradual and long-term release, or 2. Sudden release of CO2 caused by disruption of the reservoir. Carbon capture has been used as a justification for new oil and gas projects. It has a history of poor performance, only captures a fraction of the total emissions from the life cycle of oil and gas production, and its long-term efficacy is questionable. The IPCC. Even the head of the National Audit Office in the UK wrote concerning the energy security and net zero, a clash in terms itself, but wrote about the department by stating the department has now tried twice to kickstart CTS in the UK, but there are still no examples of the technology working. Well, even the audit office is concerned. This is the bad state, but don't worry, we can have energy experts sitting there, stating, that by all means, we've got this system. And by the way, no one costs it. No one gets into the costs of this. Now, I came across a piece by Ben Pyle. He's got a website called Ben Pyle Substack. And this is what he wrote. And I really think he puts it brilliantly. But the problem of useless machinery goes far beyond the device itself. Not unlike white elephants such as wind turbines, energy systems catapult is a strange outfit summoned up out of the blobbish technocracy required by the Green Agenda. ECS is part of an umbrella group of government-backed private companies called the Catapult Network, which itself seems to be part of Innovate UK, which in turn is part of UK Research and Innovation, the successor public funding body to the erstwhile research councils. ESC and its sister organisation each benefit from millions of pounds of public funding, topped up by opaque philanthropic funding, i.e. green bob organisations, which, as EEC claims, allow them to support central and devolved governments with the evidence, insights and innovations to incentivise net zero action. The problem at its core is that publicly funded organisations, though set up as independent bodies, run at arm's length from the government and are nonetheless wholly committed to the political agendas, seemingly intended to drive prosperity through R&D, such as constellation of opaque agencies are tantamount to the government picking winners, who invariably turn out to be abject losers at vast public expense. There are no consequences for such wonks spaffing hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money on pilots that come to naught, or glossy reports that might just as well be case studies from Narnia. Criticisms of ideas such as CO2 capture is excluded from academia and business because even if any critics were not already disinclined to apply for roles within the network and were then not rejected for their obvious hostility to the dominant political culture of such bullshit factories, their politically inconvenient work would soon be shelved. In other words, the Green Agenda has produced a useless machine whose only function is to produce designs for useless machines. The parent idea of DACS, carbon capture and storage, CCS, in which CO2 is taken from power stations, compressed and then stuffed under the sea, was an idea that attracted attention following the Climate Change Act. But despite the government offering £1 billion in funding competitions to prove the concept, the project failed and today remains economically unproven. The even crazier idea of pulling CO2, which is still a trace gas, at just 400 parts per million from the air and then burying it underground faces a similar future. Meanwhile, the UK's climate agenda will run on as usual, built on extremely expensive, pie-in-the-sky fantasies. Nobody has any idea how to achieve net zero without destroying ourselves. And that's from Ben Powell's Net Zero Scandal Substack, and the link to that is in the description under this video. He needs more subscribers. Back to the interview we started with, and what have the Green Party got to say about it? Well, I think they're on the side of the IPCC.
Okay.
Just on that point, yeah, I would endorse the general thrust of what John's saying, but I would fundamentally disagree with him on carbon capture being a fundamental role in how we're going to achieve net zero.
And I agree with him on that. It has no role at all. But I disagree on the next bit, and here we go.
Well, maybe this is a multifaceted win because what we know is the cost of living crisis was a fossil fuel crisis. The war in Ukraine, massive costs of gas pumped up all across Europe. America was slightly different, but the European Union cost of living crisis, massive increase of costs, all came from fossil fuels being the baseline energy costs for all these things like food, like transport, and it all filtered through to the experience now.
I'm sorry, but I now have to deal with some facts rather than guesses or feelings. So this graph goes back to 2019. And what it shows is anything above the line is a saving from wind. And anything below the line is a cost from having the wind. So along to this point here, it's negative. It costs us having the wind. And then the Ukraine war came. And sure enough, wind did save us money because just went astronomical. Yes, and for this period here, wind saved us money. But from this point here, it's costing us again. So if you take the whole 5-year period, the cost to us in the UK by having the wind instead of just gas was £18 billion. Right? That is the cost over 5 years of some £3.6 billion a year. It would have been cheaper not to have the wind. Because about a quarter of the gas price is there, just because it has to back up wind. The intermittent nature of wind means you have intermittent nature of gas demand, and it can take as much as 50% of the fuel being used in a gas turbine station in standby, waiting to be called on to meet the demand.
And what we know is if we generate our own energy with the cheapest form of energy ever, that's wind and solar and batteries as well, we know that that's going to solve that crisis for people. It's going to mean cheaper costs for people. It's going to be better.
That is an absurd statement and worthy of my Pie in the Sky award. For claiming that wind is the cheapest source of energy, ignoring all the other facts out there, such as the fact you're paying more per megawatt today for wind than you are for gas, even though gas prices have been inflated because of wind, because they're being used as a backup. But all the strike prices today are way more than the cost of gas. And secondly, because of claiming that batteries are a feasible storage solution for them. I've already issued a video of it. It's in the description below. It explains to the Isle of Man residents just how silly that is. The cost for just a population of 85,000 to cover the 9 days without wind in 2018 is a mere £3.7 billion. Simply not feasible. There we are, another video wrap-up on countering the propaganda. The problem is, as I dissect these interviews, I only go a little bit before they make a stupid statement, and then I have to deal with it. So there's lots more of these to come. Anyway, that was part 2, or cut 2, as I'm calling them. Thank you for watching.